Hello, Jennifer and Alastair. Great to have you with us again. Thank you for making time for this additional questions from the last event, Artful Leaders in Times of Transition. And yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start off with the first question. How much is culture tied to the country that the company is in? How much do you think national culture affects company culture?
Um, shall I kick off on this?
Please do.
I think it's not just about national and country culture. I think uh, that's important, but I also think that the function of the company, where it sits, what kind of company it is, the size of the company, how global it is, all of these really matter. But still, whatever happens, culture and cultural change and cultural transition is a personal business. I think you need to really acknowledge the differences, but not to be afraid of them and not to be pigeonholed. You know, we, even in this last year, we've gone through huge changes in how we have to work. And that's affected our culture wherever you sit, because there are some things you just physically can't do. If you're more of a hands-on manager, you can't do that now, you know. And if it's a more of a hierarchical organization, it's begun to be a bit flatter. People's needs are different. So I think there are some changes here. I wouldn't get tied up around sort of national culture.
Mhm.
It's important, but don't be obsessed by it.
Mm. I
Yeah.
agree. I mean, there's many, many things that can influence a culture, and part of the challenge is to figure out which bits are actually coming from where. But many organizations try to articulate their culture and enact a culture that, at least to some degree, transcends boundaries and regional differences, but also should obviously adapt to and accommodate those. So cultures are always a bit more flexible than we think they might be as well.
Right. Thank you. And I think it's a really good point that we have to move past those boundaries, cultural boundaries, so to say. And it's also very increasingly difficult to generalize one country's culture as well.
And also, Alex, you know, I think it's important in this day and age not to be confined by a narrative. You
Yes.
know, we operate out of this country and that's how we behave in this
Mhm.
country. I think, you know, that's been an important way of defining who we are and how we are. But I think those boundaries are lessening,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
particularly
I
in working
agree.
relationships.
Great. Next question. We've talked during the event about organizational culture of a specific organization, right? What's the right culture for one specific company? However, much of the work gets done between the organizations when people from different organizations collaborate.
Mm.
So, how to address this network culture, if you will, how to make the best of it in collaborating with others.
Well, I can start with that. I mean, clearly each organization does have a culture that is somewhat unique to itself, and through all of these influences we've just talked about. But that doesn't mean that you have to have the same culture in order to work well with someone else. In fact, you could have quite a different culture that is complementary. But the key thing is understanding what your culture is and what their culture is, so that you can come together and you can be actually quite explicit about how you do things. So many times we see, even with straightforward sort of partnerships, firms working together, buyers, suppliers, the sort of content of what they're trying to achieve can be relatively straightforward to agree on, but the how they actually go about achieving it, and the how they adjust when things get difficult, for example, that doesn't come up until you're in the thick of it. So if you're trying to get into a situation where you're partnering, being clear about what your culture is from the beginning, rather than just what the outcome or expected intention is really crucial.
Thank
I,
you.
just to add to that, I think that's right. So part of the conversation now, when you get two businesses, two cultures coming together to collaborate, is in those very early conversations. Yes, what is it that we're doing, and how are we going to do it, so that you begin to find the connections and indeed some of the disconnections. So you go, oh, okay, so actually if that happens, we might behave quite differently. Let's just think that through. But it's the connecting points. But also what's so important is the bigger picture. Why are we both doing this together? Why are we going to go through this collaboration and find that meeting point at the top? Because often that's where cultures need to go sometimes when you hit the kind of the bumps in the road, which you always will. What brings us together? Let's remind ourselves.
Yeah. And I like this idea of finding the complementary parts of your culture. I mean, of course, you collaborate to get the work done in a better way, and somebody complements your abilities work-wise. But I think it's also a really interesting discussion to think about the culture, that maybe another organization would add elements to our own culture when collaborating.
Because it's always kind of easy and instinctive to go, well, what separates us? You know, we're big, you're small, we're from this country, you're from that country, that. But actually to find, well, what connects us is a very positive conversation, and positivity, and, you know, adds to the momentum, particularly this time.
Yeah.
Great. Next question. How long do you think a cultural transformation takes to implement? When can you expect the first signs of change when transitioning culture?
Well, I think the first question, I wish I had a straightforward answer. The only straightforward answer I have is it always takes longer than you think. Cultural transformation is something that is planned for, that is expected to take a great deal of time. But I'm sure, Alastair, you see in your work all the time, it always takes longer, despite people planning for it taking time, because ultimately what you're changing is people's habits, their behaviors, their expectations of each other, and to reinforce those, to spread those across the organization, to have people actually take those up in their day-to-day work, and believe in them and do them, not because somebody's telling them to do, but because it works and it's the right thing and they're expecting it of themselves and each other. That's really hard. That's long work.
And so to the second kind of question in those two, Alex, which is, you know, when can you see the first glimmers, the first green shoots? That's really interesting. So, because, you know, a cultural change program can take as long as you want, you know, some are constantly going 5, 10, 15 years, you know, down the line. But the green shoots is interesting because what it does imply is that my leadership has to be aligned and consistent in their approach, because it's always leader-led. Yep, you need the rest of the organization with you, but the opening move is a leader move, and they have to be consistent as one, and they have to show it in order for people to go, all right, they really mean this. So I know various organizations are doing what they call sprints now.
Right.
Particularly actually over lockdown, in the last 12 months, they've been going, let's do this really good. Can we get something going in 2-3 months? It might have taken 12 months before, but this moment has afforded us a little bit more capacity to reinvent things in a way. And, you know, as we've seen with the vaccine, you know, was delivered in a very small number of months when it normally takes a large number of years. It's possible to do things, and culture is the same. So you can see the first green shoots, so long as you've got that leadership consistency relatively early, 2-3 months potentially, you can see the change, you can feel the change.
It takes commitment and will, I guess, from the leadership and also the rest of the organization, right?
Absolutely. And it's about habit building. You know, you've got to keep at it, and people have got to see it and believe it, and they'll test it. Do they mean this? Don't they mean this? Oh, they're still doing it. Oh, that's interesting. The program's still around. Oh, okay.
Absolutely agree. I like the image of the green shoots, but you know, green shoots are fragile. And so I think the idea that when the first green shoots come up, what do you do about that? Do you celebrate them? Do you welcome them? Do you nurture them? Do you grow the rest of the garden around those? And I think those are potentially what Alastair was implying with, you know, leaders need to seed those initially, but once they start coming up, they need to also really, really nurture and highlight and demonstrate to the rest of organization that this is who we are, this is how we're doing, and look, it's working, to sort of build towards that next level of growth, shall we say, to continue the analogy.
Yeah.
And
So
I
doing the
think it was,
sprints, but thinking long term.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it was David Thomas who recently said, you know, it's the soil, not the
Yeah.
seed that matters.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the surrounding environment, the culture, all that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's great. We've got sprints and we've got
Metaphors.
shoots, and they're coming together.
The soil.
And the
And
soil.
soil. 3 S's.
Yeah.
Great to talk in metaphors. Great. Next, how does culture change when thinking about how you assess performance in a situation where everyone works from home? You might see the end result, but not the process and how it was carried out. So I guess this touches upon, yeah, how do you monitor performance more or less?
Mhm.
Mm.
I think there's been a lot of concern, certainly early in the pandemic and in lockdowns. Initially everyone started remote working and were kind of shocked to some degree. As Alastair said, there were things that would be done quickly. We were amazed at how productive we were, but the cultural piece was a struggle. I think from the very beginning, people realized the inability for people to connect, the inability for people to sort of serendipitously bump into each other, the inability to check in with a coworker or to learn from someone, that had become very, very difficult. And so naturally, I think also managers cared about, how do I monitor performance? How do I know people are doing what they're meant to be doing? But one way of thinking about culture is it's how we want our people to act when nobody's looking. So actually, culture is really about the expectations, the practices, the norms, the standards we hold ourselves to, ourselves, not just others. And so to some degree, thinking about performance and thinking about monitoring is actually almost the opposite direction from culture.
Right.
Ideally, if you have a strong functioning culture and a culture that is supportive, and it depends on the environment, obviously, but that's supportive of professional work, ideally that culture will endure because you will trust people to get their work done. And actually, now, as we've seen with remote working, you have to trust people to get their work done when and how and under what personal circumstances they're dealing with, which are difficult for every single person, but also distinct for every single person. So I think that's where actually culture can really shine. If managers think about, how can I enable people to do their best work in a way that is supportive of them, but also cultures will be stretched because culture hasn't been asked to do all these things. That it's we wanted our cultures to support individuals and to enable them to thrive in the workplace, but we now are bringing our personal lives into work because we're working from home. And so I think that is actually a challenge that people really need to think about. How much of this are we asking organizations and managers to do, and do they have the tools to do it? But I don't think monitoring and sort of performance measurement per se, certainly not the only tool that I would suggest. What do you think, Alastair?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'd probably say these are not the times for micromanaging, right? They're gone.
Mm.
A, it's very hard, and B, why do it? Much rather put your leadership attention and focus and energy and momentum on making sure your people are able to focus emotionally and physically on the tasks that they have, and trust them to do it in their own way, because people are juggling completely different things at home. So as a leader, to step up and go, is there anything that I can do to support you in doing the work that you need to do in the deadline that has been set? That's a much more powerful leadership role to play at this time. So maybe part of the answer to the question is about what do we ask leaders now to think about in terms of measurement, but also it's a very creative time, I think, for leaders to go, how do I do this? How do I create a sense of culture when we're disparate? How do I create a sense of belonging?
Mhm.
And what is my role as a leader? I've now got to bring so much more energy, enthusiasm, encouragement, recognition to the table, as we're all based around our own kitchen tables and bedrooms and wherever it is. I've got to play a different role now from the one that I did in the office. And I think that's a creative opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, the other part of your question, Alex, was what does shift with remote work. And so clearly that role for leaders to think differently about what people need. People are going to just start doing things differently. So culture is ultimately about what we do and what we repeatedly do and what we believe we're accomplishing through the doing. So notice what things have shifted. But I think it's also important to try to remind yourselves that you haven't completely changed, that you're still an organization, that you still have certain strengths and skills that you had prior. They're just showing up in different ways. And so one of the things that I've written about is really the importance of leaders, managers, and employees at all levels actually recognizing when their culture is still happening and maybe calling attention to it in a more explicit way than you would, you know, if we were all face to face. So if people are doing a particularly good job collaborating or, you know, proactively sharing information, helping out a colleague, you know, mention that, call that out, say, this is a great example of, you know, we used to do this perhaps in a different medium, but this is a great example of who we are because this is who we always have been. And I think that also helps people with a sense of belonging. You know, my office might not be there. I'm not seeing my peers. I'm not able to go for a coffee with them, but we're still who we were, at least in some ways. We're enacting the same kind of practices and bringing forward the same kind of values. And so those have to be literally labeled and called out in order for them to be noticed more. I think one of the themes that threads through our conversation maybe so far is the importance of recognizing that culture is something that's fed from multiple influences, but also needs to be nourished, needs to be managed. And we might have to manage it a bit more explicitly right now because so many of the other cues are missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this point, that's also very practical of celebrating the good things and not taking them for granted as before. Maybe before we wouldn't need to celebrate them as much or call them out as much. I think
Yeah.
this is a really good practical point for leaders and, yeah, other employees to do.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Great. Last question. What should you do as a leader or team member when there are people in the team who don't fit in? For instance, they might be too negative, or their behavior could be influencing negatively the overall company culture.
Hmm. Um, I'll kick off if I may. I think, look, you know, businesses are a group of individuals. Yeah, we're all different. So people get things at different speeds. And I love the metaphor. I think it came from William Bridges' book about transition, which is about a marathon. You know, culture and change and transition is a marathon. And some people are right on the starting line. The pistol goes and they're off and they run it in 2.5 hours. Then you've got good runners behind and they take a bit longer. But, you know, you've then got the fun runners who are way at the back. They take half an hour just to get to the starting line, you know, and then they start jogging and off they go. And people are the same. Some people get it and they respond to it, and some people reject it, and some people sit back and just go, I'll watch for anything else. So I think it's Bob Chapman in his book talks about courageous patience. Have the courage to be patient with some people, because they will need to think through it, or they will need to assess it for themselves. And all of this stuff is personal, and it takes time for people to go, what's in it for me? What's the value of this change to me? You want me to be bolder, you want me to be, you know, act with greater integrity, whatever the kind of the mantras are. But they have to first think about the relevance to themselves before it can really sit comfortably inside them, and it's not just an add-on.
Yeah.
So that would be my thought, that you've got to be patient with
Yeah,
some people.
it's really excellent, and then it goes back to the idea of personal motivations and like this self drivers or own drivers, that there needs to be something personal in it, and not only that you need to adapt to a bigger entity because you just have to do that.
And to just take it, one last thought, you know, if someone is really struggling with that, the first question might be not about them, but about you as the leader. What am I doing wrong, you know, that that means that this person hasn't quite understood it, or it hasn't quite landed with them, or they don't feel they've got a clear choice to make, that they're sitting. So always start with your leadership first if there's some block there, and then seek to understand.
I think that's I was going to say, even you know, the question sort of also suggests that potentially, even when it's not a time of change, I mean, in particular, Alastair, you're absolutely right. In a time of change, there will be people at all different stages of the change, and people might have proceeded all the way through and be wondering, why are those stragglers still on the starting line? And so I love the idea of courageous patience. But, you know, culture is normal, culture that we're not trying to change. You will always find individuals who don't conform for whatever reason. And I think when there is a situation when somebody is really not conforming with the culture, but it's allowed and it's condoned, it can sometimes undermine the culture. So it can be sort of this bad example that is tolerated. And so other people start to, you know, question what the culture is, and is it a culture of integrity? You know, do we all have to follow it? And so I think, again, you know, like Alastair said, it comes down to leadership. So if leadership isn't willing to call out or to pay attention to people who are, you know, sort of actively not conforming, shall we say, then I think they need to start you know, asking those questions, working with that person, trying to understand, because culture is ultimately collective. And so we signal things to others through the behaviors that are not only celebrated, but also the behaviors that are tolerated. And if we're tolerating behaviors that we really don't want to be about, that really aren't who we are, then I think the worst thing that you can do is ignore it. So I think we're coming back to this message of sort of culture, like everything else, actually is something that you need to be very mindful of, pay attention to, and look at how, you know, how it's being modeled, how it's being picked up, and is that consistent? So it's sort of an active management of, not just a passive, this is who we are.
Right, yeah. And a balance between sort of respecting individuals and different personalities, and then agreeing on a common set of
right, yeah, because it's never trying to make people the same. But it is trying to work out, how do we work together across these differences, and actually with these differences as a positive within that.
And just to add to Jennifer's point, I think, and she mentioned it, that for me, in these times particularly, the great skill quality that's required is this ability for leaders to be present, to pay attention, listen deeply, notice more, and pay attention to what's going on. Don't ignore, you know, bad behavior or whatever it is. You got to know what's going on around you. Now, right now, you're having to know what's going on around you remotely. So you might have to ask more questions about, so how's the weekend been? Not just how are you? I'm fine, you know, and you just to really understand people's situations a little bit more. If that's the, you know, the relationship that you have with your colleagues and team, but paying attention is the key to this. You will know what's going on, but these are skills. Not every leader has.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, skills can also be learned, but it does take time and openness, and maybe a lot of these doors have been opened now because of this.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you practice your listening skills, for instance, you will find that, of course, your listening skills can be applied at home, and you can start listening to your bolshy 15-year-old son in a way that perhaps you haven't for a number of years.
Yeah.
How wonderful is that? Oh, it's a technique, it's a skill.
Yeah.
So
I think also, you know, ending on that sort of note of, there are opportunities also that have come out of this incredible, difficult time that we've all been through. And some of that is recognizing that actually what we've been sort of forced into, which is balancing a lot of other aspects of our lives coming together simultaneously, things start to move across those boundaries, and they can move across in ways that are really powerful in terms of the opportunity that it affords us to sort of understand who our colleagues are in a different way, or, you know, those listening skills, you know, how you manage your teenager can come into maybe how you manage your peers, right? And vice versa. And I think organizations and employees and managers who are open to that, this will have been a really interesting time, and reflecting on it, understanding which of those bits we like, which are potentially working for us. It can help rebuild a culture into something that's better than it was before, when we're all not in a remote working environment.
And of course, you know, let's not forget that leadership is, sorry, it's such a pat phrase, but it's a journey. You're always learning. You never arrive at being the leader, perfect, nothing more to learn from this situation. And culture change and transition is that great learning experience anyway. But you know, so there's a sense of humility in here. It's a word I think I used earlier about I'm a student as well as a leader. I'm picking stuff up all the time. I'm getting better at this. That's quite powerful. And of course, this last 12 months has been a massive journey of education for every single one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And it's still continuing. So
yeah,
so
we'll learn more. We'll
yeah,
learn more about ourselves and our
yeah,
leadership in the organizations. Yeah.
exactly. So maybe that's also part of the silver lining of it too.
Yeah, very much so.
Stay open to this learning journey. Thank you so much to both of you for this inspiring, very insightful conversation. And thank you to our participants from the event who threw these questions in. So made room for a really nice conversation. And thank you again, Alastair and Jennifer, for
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you both. Fantastic to chat with you both.
Indeed.
Take care.
All the best. Bye.
Bye.